Hello and welcome back to the course on artificial intelligence. Today we're going to discuss the plan of attack for this section. We're talking about Q-learning and we've got quite a few tutorials, so I think it's a good idea for us to quickly go through them to understand what to expect in the upcoming videos. So here we go. All right, what we will learn in this section. First things first, we will talk about what reinforcement learning actually is and what the philosophy behind reinforcement learning is and how reinforcement learning actually can be seen in real life and how it relates to things that we observe in real life or actually things that we do ourselves. Then we'll talk about the Bellman equation, a very fundamental concept underpinning everything or a lot of things that are happening in reinforcement learning, especially in the space of Q-learning and what we're going to be discussing in this section of the course and in the following sections. Then we'll talk about the plan and the plan that an artificial intelligence comes up with in order to navigate inside an environment, and we'll see what how that comes together. A very quick but quite interesting tutorial. Then we'll talk about market decision processes, a new concept. We're going to introduce a very new concept which will slowly even add an extra layer of sophistication to our Bellman equation, to our whole reinforcement learning, to our Q-learning concepts. And that's the way this section is structured, that we introduce the Bellman equation in a very simplistic form, and then slowly throughout the tutorials we add layers of sophistication to it in order to get to the final version that is our designated destination in terms of Q-learning. But we'll get there slowly in order for us to have enough time to process all of the information and let it settle in. And markov decision processes is an extra layer of sophistication on top of what we've already discussed, or what we will have already discussed by then. Then we'll talk about policies versus plans. Another interesting tutorial. They're all interesting. Just another quick tutorial on how policies differ from plans and what the differences there are. And these are terms that you will probably hear or read in other literature if you're going to be delving into it to get additional information on reinforcement learning. Then we'll talk about adding a living penalty to our environments. And that's kind of another way of adding complexity into the environments that our agents are going to be operating in. Then we'll talk about the intuition behind Q-learning. So up until that tutorial, we're going to be talking values of states, and then finally we're going to switch to talking about values of actions or Q values. And then we're going to introduce the temporal difference. So this is the tutorial where everything that we've learned is going to come together to explain how exactly do agents or how does artificial intelligence learn? How does it update its values throughout the iterative process that it's going through? And then finally, we're going to look at a visualization of Q-learning. So we're going to take everything we learned and we're going to look at it happen in front of our eyes and watch an artificial intelligence actually perform Q-learning and do all of the things that we're going to discuss on an intuitive level is going to actually do in practice. And that will help us even further grasp that knowledge that we're going to be covering off in this section. So hopefully you're very excited about these upcoming tutorials. I definitely am. And there's some very interesting slides coming up. And more importantly, the concepts themselves are very, very interesting. And I'm sure you're going to enjoy them quite a lot. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, enjoy AI. Hello and welcome back to the course on artificial intelligence. I hope you're excited about today's tutorial because we are taking our very first step into the world of AI, and today we're talking about reinforcement learning. It's a very important tutorial because it will underpin everything else that's going to be happening in this course. So let's get started. Here we've got a little maze, and this maze is our representation of an environment, and that's what we're going to be dealing with in this course. We're going to be dealing with certain environments in which our artificial intelligence is going to be performing, it's going to be taking actions, it's going to be looking to beat these environments, going to be looking to win in these environments. And here we've got an agent. The agent is our artificial intelligence. That's the person, or that's the mind that's going to be navigating these environments and learning from the feedback that the environments are going to be giving it in order to perform certain actions. And so the way it works is the agent performs certain actions in this environment, and as a result, the state in which it is in will change. So it might be further or closer or more to the left, more to the right. It might have a certain other parameters that describe its state. And those parameters are going to change. So the state is going to change because of the action it takes. And it will also get rewards based on the action. So every time it takes an action, the state will change and it'll get reward. Now, bear in mind, sometimes it might happen that it won't change the state. The action won't change the state, or there won't be a reward for taking that action in that certain state it was in. But nevertheless, the agent is going to keep doing that. It's going to be taking actions, changing the state, getting rewards, changing action, taking actions, changing the state, and getting rewards. And by doing that process, it's going to be learning about the environment. It's going to be exploring the environment, understanding what actions lead to good rewards and favorable states, and what actions lead to bad rewards and unfavorable states. And this is a very simplistic representation of a very global problem. So if you think about it, environments actually don't have to be just mazes. It's not just about getting out of a maze or finding a treasure in a maze. An environment can be pretty much anything in life. So imagine you waking up in the morning and cooking an omelet. So in order to make that omelet, you need to go through certain steps. You need to get the salt, get the eggs, get the frying pan, switch the fire on, and so on. And it does sound like a routine, mundane thing, but it's become routine because you've done it so many times. But in reality, it's an environment where you're performing certain actions. You're putting the fire on, you're putting the frying pan on the fire, you're putting all the eggs into the frying pan, and you're putting some salt on the eggs, and you're turning them over, and so on. So as you can see, there are certain actions which you're taking in certain states, and those actions lead to certain other states and sometimes rewards. So for instance, when you put the fire on and you wait, you're taking the action of wait too long, and then you put the eggs into the frying pan, the reward is going to be very negative. It's all going to burn. On the other hand, if you do all the correct actions in the correct times, so it's also very important to understand that actions should be taken at the correct points in time. So for instance, putting the salt in the frying pan before you put the eggs in might not be the best idea. You might want to take that action of putting the salt into the frying pan after the eggs are in there, so in a different state. So it's important to remember that. And at the same time, so if you take all the correct actions in the correct order, in the correct states, your final reward could be that you get an omelet which you can eat. And so that's a very basic activity in your life, but if you think about it, it is actually an environment, and you are the agent going through this environment and performing tasks. You don't really need to learn anything because you already know it pretty well, but at the same time you could learn. Maybe you could learn how to make a better omelet, or especially if it's your first omelet that you're making, you're probably going to screw it up, but you will learn from that because you will understand what actions lead towards states and rewards. And anything else in life, for instance, even trading on the stock market and buying and selling and getting certain feedback from the market in the sense of return, positive or negative returns, that's also an environment, and that's you participating in that environment as an agent. Driving a car is also an environment where you can turn the steering wheel, you can accelerate, you can brake, and so on, and you're getting feedback from the environment. And one of those feedbacks is a policeman giving you a speeding fine if you're going above the acceptable or allowed speed limit on that highway. And therefore, from there, you learn that, okay, that's not something that should be done because it leads to a negative reward. So rewards don't have to be just at the very end of the process. They can be throughout the journey, throughout the process. So those are a couple of examples. And in terms of AI, the simplest way to think of reinforcement learning is like training a dog. When you train a dog, you give it certain commands, and if it obeys those commands, then you give it a treat. You give it like a biscuit or something. If it doesn't obey those commands, you tell it that it's a bad dog, or you just don't give it a treat. And through that process, it learns what certain commands or what it needs to do, what action it needs to take in certain states. And the states are the commands that you're giving it. And based on that, it will get certain rewards. Of course, in the world of AI, it's not that complex. You don't have to give the AI treats. You don't have to have like a bag of biscuits with you every time. You just give it a +1 or a -1. So it's a huge advantage that in the world of AI, we've created these AIs ourselves. So the rewards that we're giving them, if you think about it, this is really cool. If the rewards you're giving them, they don't actually exist. There's just a plus or a minus one, or a plus, a one or a zero, something like that. So it's all non-existent, it's all imaginary stuff. But at the same time, it leads to great results. We can create these amazing things, these amazing artificial intelligences by just providing rewards which don't really exist, the plus and minus one. It doesn't cost us anything, but at the same time, it leads to results. So very similar to real world and that example of dogs, but here the rewards are digital and just numbers. And with that in mind, we can talk about a little bit about robo-dogs. I love this example. So this is just a random picture. It's not necessarily that exact robo-dog, that is trained through reinforcement learning. Some robo-dogs, especially the older ones, you'd have an algorithm in there. And this is actually a good example of the difference between pre-programmed agents and reinforcement learning agents. So you could have a robo-dog which is pre-programmed to how to walk. It will say, so in the algorithm behind the dog, in the software, it'll say, okay, so in order to walk, you need to move your left leg forward, left front leg forward, then your back right leg forward, then your front right leg forward, then your back left leg forward, and repeat that action. And that's a definition of walking. It's a function inside this dog. And then it might have, how to sit, how to stand, and things like that. Whereas in a robot dog that is trained through reinforcement learning, what happens is you don't pre-program it. This is the key concept to everything here, that you don't have any algorithm inside that is hard-coded into the dog. Instead, you have what we'll be discussing in the future. You have this reinforcement learning algorithm, which is told that, okay, so the goal is to get from where you are now, not knowing anything, to the end of the room, for example. And here are the certain actions you can take. You can move your right foot, you can move your left foot, you can move your right back foot, your left back foot. So here are all the degrees of freedom that you can do. You can move them like this, you can move them like that. So like a list of actions you can take. And your rewards are every time you take a step forward, you get a +1. Every time you fall over, you get a -1. And that's all there is to it. And then they just leave the dog and let it figure it out on its own. So the dog tries to stand up, it falls, and it realizes that, okay, I shouldn't do that action that led to me falling, because every time I fall, I get a -1, which is not good for me. Then, so it does the other action that helped it stand up. And then it figures out, it just experiments, tries things randomly, and then figures out that it can make a step forward by moving its right front foot. And it gets a +1, and it realizes, oh, I should do more of that. Okay, cool. So it now learns that it should do more of this and less of that. And through this learning process, it very quickly understands how it can walk. And those dogs that figure it out on their own can actually sometimes walk better than dogs that are pre-programmed. Because when we pre-program things, we look at the real live dogs or we use our own imagination how to do it. Whereas a reinforcement learning dog can optimize things on its own, and because it's an AI, sometimes it can get even better results. And that's how they can train these same robot dogs to play soccer. You can't train a normal dog to play soccer because, simply the whole approach is different, and it's not something that probably a normal dog has been trained to do or has ever done in its process of its evolution. Whereas reinforcement learning robot dogs can very easily understand how to play soccer as long as you tell them what the rewards are, what the goals are, what the possible actions they can take are. So that is how reinforcement learning works in general. That's a quick overview of reinforcement learning. I hope that got you very excited about what's going to come next, because it's a completely different world compared to pre-programmed solutions or hard-coded solutions where you have the if-else conditions. This is very different, and we're going to be talking more about that. In the meantime, we've got some additional reading for you. So if you'd like to have some supporting materials, here's a great article which you can look into. It's called Simple Reinforcement Learning with TensorFlow. It's got 10 parts. The link is here, and you'll find the clickable link in the course resources. It's by Arthur Giuliani. It's a 2016 article. And you can follow along this course and also get additional information from that article. But bear in mind that article is with TensorFlow, whereas in this course we are using PyTorch. So different implementations, but at the same time, you might pick up a few things here and there that might supplement your learning that we're going to be doing in this course. So great article to follow, even if you're not considering following it for sure. Just in case, check out that first part and see if you like it, see if you would like to read it a bit more. And then we've got specific to this tutorial about reinforcement learning. There's a paper by Richard Sutton, which is called Reinforcement Learning 1 Introduction. It's a 1998 paper, so quite old, but it's, at the same time, you can learn a bit about reinforcement learning, some of the examples like that omelette example and other examples of where reinforcement learning can be applied, and just a general overview of reinforcement learning if you are looking for some additional reading. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this tutorial. Can't wait to see you next time, and until then, enjoy AI. Hello and welcome back to the course on artificial intelligence. Today we're going to talk about the Bellman equation. It's quite a complex topic, and we're going to introduce it in a step-by-step manner throughout this whole section of the course. So we're not going to just jump straight into the most complex version of the Bellman equation right away, but instead we're going to introduce it slowly in order to gradually understand how it works. And I hope you're cool with that approach. If you are, let's get straight into it. So we're going to have a couple of key concepts that we're going to be operating with. And these concepts are: S stands for state, so the state in which our agent is, or any other possible state in which it can be. A represents an action that an agent can take. So an agent can have access to a certain list of actions, and actions are very important when they're looked at in a state combination. So when you're in a certain state and then you look at actions, then it starts to make sense what's going to be the result of those actions. Because if you look at an action by itself without a state, it doesn't really make sense because you don't know where you are and where you can possibly end up in. Then we'll have R, which stands for reward, and that's the reward the agent gets for entering into a certain state. And gamma is the discount factor. And we'll talk about the discount factor in a second. It all makes sense just now. But let's just take a note, make a mental note that we are going to have this letter gamma that we'll be operating with later on. So the person behind the Bellman equation is Richard Ernest Bellman. He was a applied mathematician and came up with the concept of dynamic programming, which we now call reinforcement learning, or which we call the Bellman equation now that's what we call it now. And in 1953, he came up with that concept, and that's when the Bellman equation came to be. So let's have a look at how this all works. There's our lovely agent in the bottom left corner, and he is in a maze. And this is quite a classical maze where you've got some blocks. The white blocks are blocks in which the agent can step into. The gray block is the one that is just not accessible, so that's like a wall in this maze. The green is where the agent should be aiming to end up in. That's where we want the agent to go. That's the finish. And the red is a fire pit. So if the agent falls into the fire pit, he will lose the game. So in the fire pit, the reward, which is R, is -1. So that's our way of telling the agent that's not something we want you to do. Like, remember an example of when we're training dogs, we want to tell them like bad dog if it's not doing the right thing that we want it to do. Same thing here. We want to tell the agent that this is not something you should be doing. It shouldn't be ending up in the square. So every time it does end up in the square, it'll get a -1 reward. So it will be punished with a -1 reward. On the other hand, if it ends up in the green square, it will get a +1 reward, meaning that that is what we want it to do. So those are the two rewards that the agent can possibly get. And how does it learn how to operate in this maze? Just like in that example of the robot dogs that learn to walk, we're just going to let it know. We'll just tell it that here are the actions you can do. You can go up, right, left, or down. Those are the 4 possible actions that you can take. And that's it. Have a play around with that. See what you can come up with. So the agent might go to the right. Then they might go more to the right. They might go back to the left. They're just randomly pressing these buttons, and they're trying to see what happens. Then they go back here, they go up, go down, go up, go right. So for now, they haven't learned anything. So far, nothing has happened. They go right, and then bam, they end up in the green square. So they realize, wow, I just got a +1 reward. So as soon as they stepped into the green square, they got a +1 reward. And that triggers the algorithm to say, okay, that's really cool. I am rewarded for ending up in this square. So I want to end up in this square. So what does that mean for the agent? That means it starts to ask the question, how did I get to this square? What was the preceding state I was in, and what action did I take to get into the square? And then it looks back and it says, okay, so the preceding state was this one. It turns out to be valuable in that state, the one that's marked with the red arrow, because from that state, I'm just one step away from getting the maximum reward I can possibly dream of +1, like a biscuit for a dog. From as soon as I know, if I ever am in that state, that square marked with the red arrow, all I'll have to do is press right. So how do I tell myself, how do I remember that that state is valuable? Well, to me, there's no difference actually. As the agent, there's no difference in whether I am in the green square or in the white square, right? In the green square, I get the reward of 1. So I'm going to mark for myself that the white square for me, it has the value of 1 because it leads exactly to reward 1. So as soon as I'm in the white square, I know I'll just take one more action, I'll be in the green square, and I'll get a reward of 1. So that's why I'm going to say that the value of this square is equal to 1, because it leads directly without any sort of subtractions. As soon as I'm in here, I know my reward will be 1. So I'm going to mark this square as v equal to 1. That's the value, that's the perceived value of being in this state. Next, the agent's going to be like, okay, so how did I get into this square? And, he might walk around again and so on, end up in this square again, and be like, okay, how did I get into this square before that? And the way I got into this square was from this square. Interesting. Okay, so as soon as I get into this square, I know that all I have to do is go right, and then from here I already know that I'm going to win. I know exactly how everything's going to unravel from here, and I know the value of being in this state is equal to 1. And since there's nothing is stopping me from going from here to here, the value in this is going to, the perceived value, I'm going to value being in here as v equal to 1 as well. Because as soon as I'm in here, I know I'll be here, and I'll be here pretty quickly, so I'm going to win. And then how do I get into this square before that? Well, I got into this square from this square. So the value, a similar approach, the value of being here is also equal to 1. And so on. So the value of being here is equal to 1, and the value of being here is equal to 1, because each one of them leads to the next one and leads to the finish line. So that's all like pretty logical at this stage. This is us pretty much designing the Bellman equation right now. So we could possibly think about designing an equation that helps an agent go through the maze. So look at the reward, then the preceding state, give it a value of equal to reward, the preceding state, and so on. So it kind of like creates this pathway. It's all great and well, but the problem here is, okay, what happens if our agent, for some reason, starts in this state? Instead of starting here and taking these actions, but it actually starts in this state. How does it know? How does it remember which action to take? Should it go right or should it go down? Or should it maybe go left or should it go up? How does it remember which is the next continuation from here? If the only values it has is these values of equal to 1. So it cannot see what's further away. It can only see, all right, what I have here and what I have here. How does it know which way to go? Well, at this stage, it doesn't. It's pretty identical for the agent which way to go. And so that's why this approach doesn't really work. It's a very simplistic explanation. Of course, there's much more to it, but in an intuitive way, that's why we kind of just carry on this value backwards like that, because one of the reasons is once the agent is in between these two values, where is it going to go? It can get confused like that. And so how do we solve this problem? What are we going to do here? And this is where we're going to start introducing the Bellman equation in its actual form slowly, step by step. So the Bellman equation looks something like this. So we've already talked about V, the value of being in a certain state. S is your current state or any given state. And there is S as well. And S prime is the state, the following state, the state that you will end up in after this state, and by taking a certain action. But we know that there's many actions that an agent can take, and that's why we've got this max over here. So by taking an action, what will happen to an agent? So let's say we're in state S. By taking an action in state S, and we take action A, what will happen is we'll instantly get a reward by getting into a new state. And remember that reward can be 1 or +1 or -1 if it's at the end of the game, or it can be a 0 if it's throughout the game. In this case, our reward throughout the game is 0. So that's the reward. Plus, we will get into a new state which has value of S prime. So that's the value of the new state. And gamma. We'll talk about gamma in a second. But the point I'm trying to raise here or the point I'm raising here is that we've got many different actions that we can take, and that's why we've got the maximum. So by taking action, we get a reward, plus we end up in a new state. And so for every in our case, we have 4 possible actions. For every one of the possible 4 actions, we're going to have a equation like this. So this is going to have a value they will have a different value for every one of the 4 actions. And we're going to look at only the maximum because, of course, the agent wants to take the optimal state. So if he's in state S, he's going to look at these values. He's going to find the maximum based on the action and going to take that action that leads to the maximum of these values. So hopefully that makes sense why we're taking the maximum here. Then once we've got the reward and the value of the state, why do we have this gamma parameter here? Well, it's there exactly to solve that problem of where the agent doesn't know which way to go because it cannot, it's comparing the values of 2 states on both sides and they're the same. That's why the gamma is called the discounting factor. So we're going to have a look at that in practice now to better understand it. So let's take our formula. We'll put it here on the top right. And now we will analyze what the values of these different states are. And every state here is a square now made. So any one of these white squares is a state, and we were going to calculate the value of being in that state. So let's start with this square. What is the value of being in this state? Well, we need to take the maximum of this value across all actions. And we know that this value is maximized as we get closer to the finish line. That's how it's constructed. And just by looking at it, you can see, because here it's got the reward and here it's got a discounting factor multiplied by the value of the next state. And it just makes sense that that's how we would construct that equation. So it makes sense that from here, the maximum of this value will be if we move to the right. So that's how we calculate the value of the state. This value of this state is equals the maximum or equals to this value if we move to the right, if we take an action of moving to the right. So what will this value be? Well, the reward of moving to the right is equal to 1. And regardless of what gamma is, we don't have a value in the state because we are already in the best state possible. So this is the final state. It won't have a value. We just get a reward here, and that's the end of the game. So the value will be of this maximum will be equal to 1. And that's why value of state S here is equal to 1. Now, things get interesting when we move to the left, when we move backwards a bit. So now let's calculate the value of being in this state. And for that, we're going to need gamma. So let's say our discounting factor is a 0.9. And it'll make sense what a discounting factor is once we calculate this. So from here, just based on our intuition and because we know how this maze works, we know that the best possible action is go to the right, because from here we go here. So that means the maximum will be achieved when in this state you go to the right. And so let's see what happens if we plug it in here. So if you go from here to here, you don't get any reward, it will still be a 0. But then you'll get gamma, so you get 0.9 times the value of the new state, which is 1. So in this case, the whole result of this is 0.9 times 1 equals 0.9. So that's our value, 0.9. So if we calculate this now, you'll see that from here, we know, just by looking at the maze, we know, because as humans, because we're understanding how this equation works, of course, an AI, the agent would have to experiment with these things. But because we have like a crystal ball, we can see this whole maze, we have like the bird's eye view right now, we know that the best action is to go to the right. So if we plug it all in here, it'll be 0, no reward, plus 0.9 times the value in this state, 0.9 is 0.81. And so on. So here it'll be 0.73, and here it'll be 0.66. So you can see that the way the discounted factor works is it discounts the value of the state as you are further away. So if you're familiar with finance theory, then it's something similar to time value of money. Like, what would you think about it this way? What would you prefer, to have $5 today or $5 in 10 days from now? Just if somebody was to give you a choice, I will give you $5 today, or I'll give you $5 10 days from now. Well, of course, you would choose $5 today. Why is that? Well, because you can take those $5 and you can invest them at a certain interest rate, which is very similar to gamma, and your $5 in 10 days will actually grow into maybe $5.73 or something like that. And that's how time value of money works, and very similar concept here. And the important thing to understand here, this is just a theory, a way that reinforcement learning works. So Richard Bellman came up with this equation, and from then, now that's how we use it. So you could go ahead and come up with a different equation. It doesn't have to have gamma, it might have some other factor, it might not even have a factor. But this approach works, and that's why we're using it. And This is what it visually looks like. So the further away you are, the less value of this it being in this state. And in terms of time value of money, if I could say to you, where would you rather be? Would you rather be here? Would you rather be here? You would say, I would rather be here. So we're creating that same phenomenon as in time value of money. We're artificially creating it through gamma, so that in order to incentivize agents or inspire agents to be closer to the finish line. So if an agent were to be asked, would you rather be here or here? Because of the way this equation works, it would choose to be here. There's nothing more to that, nothing less. It's not something that the world works this way. No, it's just something that we're artificially creating in order for our agents to understand that this is good, this is good, this is good. They're all good, but this one is better than this one, and this one is better than this one, and this one is better than this one. And that way you can see the agent can see in which direction it needs to go. So it can see that if I'm standing here, remember that problem that we had, or was he standing here? Yeah, so if he's standing here, do I go down, or like if I'm standing here, do I go up or do I go down? Well, now it's not a problem anymore, because you can see that it's actually better to go up because the value is bigger here. And then from here it's better to go right because the value is bigger here than here. And then from here it's better to go right because the value here is bigger than here and then here. And then from here, he already knows that he needs to go right because he'll get a reward here of 1. So that's how this whole approach works. Now let's have a quick look at the rest of the square. So how do we calculate the value in this square? Well, here is where things get a bit tricky. So from here, you might not actually go left, right? You might actually go right. So we can't just keep going like that, because it might actually be shorter to go this way. So what we're going to do is we're going to calculate the value in this square first. And because obviously from here, the best way to go is up. Again, that's because we have the crystal ball, we can see things. And you'll see further down in this section, you'll see how the agent actually explores this, understands this on their, like through experimentation. But for us, we know that it's better to go this way. So we're going to calculate the value here. And that's why we're going to calculate the value in this square first. So here we have 3 possible actions. In reality, we actually have 4. We can also go left. The agent could hypothetically press left and bump into the wall and stay here. But for simplicity's sake, we're just going to show the actions that we, knowing what we know and having the crystal ball, we know which actions are the ones actually to lead to something other than the same state again. And so here, from here, we know that again, just because we have a crystal ball, we know that the best way to go is this way. An agent, of course, would have to experiment and find the best way. And you will see how that happens further down in the section. You'll see actually how an agent walks around and how you would experiment trying to find these values. But for us, we know it's that way. So here, if we plug everything in, 1, so the maximum, the best output is when you go up. Here's a 1, 0.9, 0. So you plug that in, you get 0.9. Okay, so we calculate that one. Let's calculate this one. Same approach. This is, you have 3 ways you can go. Actually 4 for the agent, but for us, we can see it's only 3. So 0.81. From here, you have 0.73. And it actually ties in nicely with this value, because then if you discount again, you get 0.66. And here you have 0.73 because this is the optimal route. So there you go. That is the values of all of these states. And now you can see that because we've created this equation, and we've created synthetically this whole concept of the closer you are to the finish line, the more valuable that state is. Now, because we've created that, now it's pretty obvious for the agent which way it should go. And we'll talk more about that in the coming tutorials. I hope you enjoyed today's session. And I know it might sound a bit very basic at this stage, but as we go through this section, we will add a bit more complexity to it. At the same time, if you cannot wait, if you want to jump into it, then there's a paper which you can look at, and it is the original paper by Richard Bellman. It's called The Theory of Dynamic Programming from 1954, and you can find it at this link. And there you go. So you can jump straight into it and read from the author of the Bellman equation. But just bear in mind that this is quite a mathematically heavy paper. And on that note, I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, enjoy AI. Hello and welcome back to the course on artificial intelligence. So we've talked about the Bellman equation and we've analyzed our little maze. Let's have a look at the plan. What is the plan? Well, here is our maze analysis, and we know that we can see actually the states, the values of each state. We can see what the value of being in every single state is, and therefore the AI can, or the agent can, navigate this maze. So what is the plan? Well, the plan is simply like a treasure map for the artificial intelligence. Instead of looking at these values, let's just replace them with arrows, which indicate in which direction the agent should go because it knows those values. So an ideal scenario, after it's explored this environment, it knows the values of being in each state, and therefore it can come up with this map. So let's have a look again. We know that here value is 1. So if you are here, out of the 2, the better one is this one. So you go right. From here, out of the 2, this one's a better one, this one's a better one, this one's a better one. Or actually from here, you have 2 options, right? So here's kind of like a tie, so you just pick one at random. Doesn't matter which one, because the value in either case is the same, and more so, even if we look through, it'll take the same number of steps to get to the end. From here, you've got 3 options, but this one is the better value. From here, this one is a better value. From here, obviously, this one's a better value because here you just get a -1 reward right away. And here, from here, you have like 3 actually. So, but this one is the best one out of them, best value of the state. And so, therefore, if we replace them with arrows, it makes sense that this is how the agent would go. If it starts here, or if for some reason it ends up in this square, it knows how to get out of here. And it starts in this square, it knows how to get out of here, and so on. So that is what a plan is. And don't confuse plan with policy, because we're going to be talking about policies further on. Policies are very similar to plans, but they have a little trick to them because the environment is going to be a bit different. It's going to be stochastic. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next tutorial. So I can't wait to see you on the next one. And until then, enjoy AI. Hello and welcome back to the course on artificial intelligence. And today we're talking about Markov decision processes, or MDPs. Let's have a look what we've got today. So last time we stopped on the concept of a map. So because we've calculated the values based on the Bellman equation, we can derive this map for our agent of this maze. And basically what that means is wherever the agent starts, so let's say it starts over there, it knows exactly which steps to take in order to get to the finish line. So it just goes up, right, and done. And so the question here is that it? Is it really that simple? Is reinforcement learning really that, for the lack of a better word, boring? Once you have the map, that's it. All you have to do is you're done. You just follow the map. Well, the reality is that it's not actually that all simple. And that's a good thing, because it makes this course more interesting for us, and we can actually solve much more complex problems. So this is where Markov processes come in. But first, we're going to talk about 2 things. We're going to talk about deterministic search versus non-deterministic search. So let's talk about the concept of deterministic search. This is our agent in the maze, and deterministic search means that if the agent decides to go up, then what will happen is, with 100% probability, it will go up. That's exactly what will happen. There's no other options. Once it says go up or clicks the up arrow, it will go up. There's no other options. Now, on the other hand, non-deterministic search is when our agent says it wants to go up. There are actually a couple of options. For example, there could be 3 options. And we're going to be looking at an example where there are 3 options, but it doesn't have to be limited to 3. It could be 4. It could be, depends on the problem. The randomness could be different. But in our case, there could be 3 options. With an 80% chance, he does go up. But then with a 10% chance, when he wants to go up, he'll actually go to the left. Just because that's how the environment works. That's the world that he lives in. And with another 10% chance, he'll actually go right. And in this case, he'll fall into the fire pit. So that is how it all works. That's an example of a non-deterministic search, a stochastic process. And what the point of this is to make a more realistic model of what could actually happen in a real world type of problem. Because very rarely do you get situations like this when you do something and it happens exactly that way. And even if you think about it in terms of games, let's say you've got an agent playing Pac-Man, well, not always is it the case that if he's standing in this square, he goes up, he will get the same exact result every time. He will indeed go up, but it may be in one case he won't get eaten by a ghost, in another case he will get eaten by a ghost. So as you can see, there's some randomness to it because it depends on how the ghosts are moving, and they don't always move the same way. They don't always start in the same locations. So it's very logical. It's fair that there is some randomness. There's something that is not under the control of the agent, and this is just a way for us to represent that in order for us to learn how we can deal with it and how that affects the Bellman equation, how it affects the whole reinforcement learning process. But at the same time, the randomness is of course not limited to if you go up, there's a 10% chance you'll go right, or 10% chance you'll go left. Or if you go down, there's a 10% chance you'll go right or left. Or if you go right, there's a 10% chance you'll go up or down. It's not limited to where you're going to end up. Sometimes you might have a problem that is exactly like this. Sometimes the probabilities might be different. Sometimes the randomness might boil down to something else. It might be boiled down, like in that example of Pac-Man, of the ghosts eating you or not eating you, or it might boil down to something different. For instance, like there's like if the agent is playing Doom, and then there's something like a monster which is going to shoot him in one case, in another case there's a probability with which it will get shot and with which it won't get shot, and so on. So something that is out of the control of the agent, something that it cannot predict. That's what we're modeling here in non-deterministic search. And this is where we have directly approached two new concepts: Markov processes a Markov process and a Markov decision process. So let's have a look at these. And you know how much I don't like to put definitions and lots of text on the slides, but in this case, it is necessary for us to go through them. So let's have a look. A stochastic process has a Markov property if the conditional probability distribution of future states of the process, conditional on both past and present states, depends only upon the present state, not on the sequence of events that preceded it. A process with this property is called a Markov process. Very complex definition, and it kind of like even a little bit, not contradicts itself, but it feels like it contradicts itself. So here it says conditional both on past and the present states, depends only upon, but at the same time, it only depends upon the present state. So don't get too bogged down in that. I'll break it down in simple terms. So a Markov property is when your future states, so not just your choice, but the whole thing, your choice and the environment, it will only, like the results of the action you take in that environment will only depend on where you are now. It will not depend on how you got there. And that's it. So that's a Markov property, and a process which has this property is called a Markov process. So to put it into an example, so if your agent is here, and if he decides to go up, he might go, in our case, in our non-deterministic search example, he actually might go left and right, or right. That's because we have that stochasticity inside our environment. We have that randomness inside our environment. So any one of these three might happen. But the key here is that this is a Markov process because we don't care how he got here. He could have come from the top, ended up here. He could have come from the left, ended up here. He could have come from the bottom, ended up here. He could have moved around here like 100,000 times and then got here. It does not matter what happened before. Only what matters is which state is he in now. And so the probabilities of going left or right or up, they will always be the same if he's in this state now. And so that's basically just saying, it doesn't matter what happened before, we're here now, this is the state you're in. And don't forget that state doesn't just mean where he's standing. The state is the state of the agent in the environment. So is there like monsters on the right, or are there monsters on the left, or is the ghost coming from the top of the bottom? Whatever state you're in now, doesn't matter how you got there, doesn't matter how it all came to be that you're there in that state now. What will happen in the future is only determined by the state you're in now, plus the actions you will take. Then plus, of course, the randomness that is overlaid on top of that. So that's a Markov process. And a Markov decision process, or an MDP, or Markov decision processes, provide a mathematical framework for modeling decision-making in situations where outcomes are partly random and partly under control of a decision maker. So important to understand that Markov decision processes are different. A different whole concept to a Markov process. They're kind of like a mathematical framework. So But at the same time, I thought it was important for us to understand what a Markov process is, because I think it still helps in the understanding of a Markov decision process. So a Markov decision process is exactly what we've been discussing up till now. So that the agent lives in this environment where it has control. Like, remember previously it had full control of what's going on, but now it has a little bit less control. It can decide to go up, but it actually knows, okay, so if I go up, there's an 80% chance I'll go up, there's a 10% chance I'll go left, 10% chance I'll go right. So not everything is fully under its control. There is some randomness in this environment. That's exactly what a Markov decision process is. A Markov decision process is the framework that the agent will use in order to understand what to do in this environment. So we've got an environment with some stochasticity, some randomness, and now the agent has to choose, for instance, should it go up, down, left, or right. It has to make that decision. It doesn't know what to do. And in order to make that decision, it's going to apply a framework. It's going to be using a Markov decision process in order to make that decision, what's going to happen, where it's going to go. And so basically this environment that poses this problem, it is referred to the Markov decision process. So it's the framework that agent using. At the same time, the environment is referred to that the agent is operating in a Markov decision process environment. And so basically here we've got two concepts. We've got the Markov process is the way this environment is designed, that what happens from where you are now doesn't depend on the past. And at the same time, we've got the Markov decision process is the framework that the agent is going to be using in order to solve this environment. And the good news is that the Markov decision process, or that framework that we're talking about, is actually just an add-on to our Bellman equation, is the Bellman equation, but just a bit more sophisticated. So let's have a look at that. This is our Bellman equation so far. It's the maximum of all possible actions. So the value of being in a state is the maximum of all possible actions that you can take from that state. The maximum is taken from the reward that you would get by taking that action in that state, plus a discount factor times the value of the next state, which is S prime. So that's what we've had so far. And now, because we have some randomness in our whole process, this part will change, because we don't actually know which state we'll end up in. We don't know what S prime will be. Will it be, if we're going up, will it be up, or will it be left, or will it be right? So we actually have to place this with the expected value of the next state. So here we're going to replace this. So there's three possible states we can end up in. And so we're going to replace that with, that's a value, that state has a value of S1 prime. That state has a V of S prime 2, S2 prime. And this state has a value of V of S3 prime. So now we're going to multiply the state that we actually are intending to go into by 80%, because that's our probability of getting into that state, plus the probability of getting into this state, 10% plus probability of getting in this state. So this is just our expected value. So if from statistics, if we take the expected value of getting into, of the state that we'll get into, so kind of like the average, what's the average of what we'll get? And then we replace that over here, then we get this equation. Now, it jumps very quickly just because this equation is bigger, but if you look at it carefully, you'll see it's exactly the same thing. So you've got max here, you've got max here. Then you've got R of S and A, you've got R of S and A. Here you've got gamma, you've got gamma. And then finally, here you've got V, so you knew exactly, it was a deterministic search. You knew which state you'll get into. Now you don't know which state you'll get into, so instead of taking V, you're taking the expected value of the state you'll get into, or of the future state, or just in simpler terms, you're just taking the average of what you'll get into. So, you know, if like it was like if it was a 33% chance, then it'll be like this plus this plus this divided by 3, basically. But in this case, it's not exactly like average. It's a weighted average because of your probabilities here. So here you've got the probability of, when you're in this state, you take this action of getting into state S prime times the value of S prime and summed across all S primes that you could possibly get into over here. So exactly what we had 3 here, 1, 2, 3, add them up, multiply by probabilities, add them up. Same here, 1, 2, 3, multiply them by probabilities and add them up. And that is your new Bellman equation. Congratulations. This is what we're going to be working with going forward. And that is the framework that is used in Markov decision processes. So that is the framework that solves this, that agents use to solve this whole stochastic, non-deterministic search problem where there's random events that are happening that they cannot control. So it's much more complex, but as you can see, because we built up slowly to it, now we already know about this, we already know about this, we already know about this. We know about this, we know about this. So all we did is we just introduced this part over here because there are probabilities involved in the action, or the consequences of your action are non-deterministic. They are based on certain probabilities. And so there we go. That's how a Markov decision process works and the underlying equation behind it. Once again, it is something that more closely resembles real world problems, real world scenarios, or even game scenarios, because not everything is straightforward. There is some randomness involved, and not always will taking an action in a certain state will always not always will it lead to the same outcome. And so this is what we're going to be dealing with going forward, and that's going to make things way more interesting. So hopefully you're excited for that and excited to see what's going to come next. And in the meantime, I found a really cool paper for you to have a look at. This time it's a very applied paper. So this one's actually really interesting to read through. It's called A Survey of Applications of Markov Decision Processes, and it was written by White in 1993. There's a link, and it'll show you examples of where Markov decision processes actually are used to model real life scenarios. I think I was very excited by this. I was impressed by some examples. So population harvesting, for instance. So let's say you have some fish, and you know what the population of the fish is. You need to decide how many fish can we fish out this year, and so that's your current state, that's the action that you're taking, how many can we fish out this year, so that what are the possible outcomes of that, how many fish will we have next year, how many fish will we have the year after, and the year after, and so on. And it's not deterministic, because it's not like if you take out, I don't know, 90% of the population, then next year you will have, you know, back to 100%. It's not exactly deterministic. There are certain random factors involved which are out of our control, and therefore we have to understand what's going to happen. We have to model what's going to happen. That's where a Markov decision process is used. Agriculture, there's an example, like same thing, like harvesting crops. How much crops do we harvest? How much do we not harvest? Another one which I looked at, finance and investment. Like an insurance company needs to decide how much of its funds it will invest in any given, I think, day or year or some period of time. And there are certain factors that are out of its control. For instance, you know, the market movements, it doesn't know what can happen. So it needs to actually model that somehow, and a Markov decision process is used for that. So here you can see lots and lots of examples, and this is the number of examples given, I think, for each one. And so, yeah, even sports, 2 examples for sports and epidemics and motor insurance claims, inspections and maintenance and repair, and so on. So very interesting. Have a look at that, just to give you an understanding of, hey, this is not just all made up stuff, hypothetical, the Matrix type of thing. This is actually a real world scenario. So it'll give you a better understanding. And this is what we talked about in the promotional video for this course, that or the description of the course, that we're going to inspire you and your intuition to give you ideas for how to use AI in real life. This is your opportunity. Look at this paper to understand, okay, so we're going to be dealing with Markov decision processes going forward. That's really cool. What do they look like in real life? And this possibly could trigger some ideas for you how you could apply AI in the future to make the world a better place. And we'd be super happy about that. We'd be super happy if you could use what you learn in this course to make the world a better place with AI. How fantastic would that be? So on that note, I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, enjoy AI. Hello and welcome back to the course on artificial intelligence. Previously, we had quite a strenuous and long tutorial on Markov decision processes, and hopefully you got along well with that, and hopefully I could explain things in a approachable and engaging way. And today we're going to talk about policies versus plans. It's going to be a quick and fun tutorial, because now we're entering into a new world. We're entering into a world of stochastic search, non-deterministic search. It's not just about getting through the maze, but also accounting for random factors that might just hit you in the head when you're going through this maze, and you need to be prepared for them. That's the world our agent is living in, and it's more fun, but it's also more dangerous. It's less predictable. So how is our agent going to behave? Let's have a look. There's our Markov decision process framework, which is once again our favorite Bellman equation. However, the more advanced version of the Bellman equation we were working with. So from now on, we're just going to call this the Bellman equation. And here we've got our maximum across all actions. So the value of a state, any S state S, is the maximum across all actions that an agent can possibly perform in that state. And the maximum was taken from the reward that the agent will get by performing action A in state S plus a discount factor multiplied by the expected value of the new state it will be in. And the expected value is taken here because it doesn't know exactly what state it'll end up in. There are some random effects that are present in the environment that might alter the state, and he might not end up in the desired state. He might end up in a different state. That's why we're taking the expected value over here, this sum over here. So let's have a look at this as our example, or in our example of the maze. So this is what we had previously. So previously we were dealing with deterministic search. So we knew that, all right, so if I'm here, I definitely need to go here. If I'm here, I definitely need to go here. If I'm here, I definitely need to go here. If I'm here, I'm here. So it was all pretty straightforward. Once you have this map, and remember we called it a plan. Once you have the plan, it's pretty straightforward what you need to do. There are our arrows. So that's the plan with the arrows. And from here, it was very straightforward. These are the routes that the agent would take. Wherever you start on this blue line, that's exactly the way you would go. However, now we don't have a plan anymore. We can't have a plan because, whatever we plan might not happen. It's not under our control. A plan is when you know exactly what you need to do next. You know the steps. So you have a starting point, you have a goal, and you know every single step, so you can plan them out. You're like, I'll do this one, I'll do this one, I'll do this one, like in life, like a plan. But at the same time, there's so much now randomness going on. You can't have a plan because what if you get here and then you click to the right and actually takes you down? So that's not part of your plan. So that's why it's not called a plan anymore. And here we're going to calculate the values, or we're actually going to just look at the calculated values for this same problem, but given that we have this randomness inside. So these are the new values. And so why are these values different? So let's just compare it to what we had previously. This is what we had previously. These are the new values. So once again, we had previously, you can see 1, 0.9, 0.81, 73, 66, and this is what we have now. 86, so less than 1, 74, 71, 63, and so on. And by the way, these are not exactly the correct values. These are off the top of my head, but if we were to run an agent, values would be something similar to this. And the values could change because depending on the gamma that we choose, 0.9 or other value. But nevertheless, for argument's sake, these are the values that we're dealing with now. And they're approximate. They convey the whole notion in the correct way. So let's have a look at them. Why have they changed? Well, why is here, let's start with this one. Here the value was 1. Why is it all of a sudden 0.86? Why is it less than 1? Can't we just go from here? Well, we actually can't, because from here, if we go right, which is our intention, if we go right, we would actually, with a 10% chance, we'd end up here. So we'd hit the wall and we'd be back in this state. And remember, we have a gamma, so the value would be discounted. Or with a 10% chance, we would end up here in this state. So it's not 100% probability I would get here. So therefore, this value can no longer be a 1. It's something less. And let's say it's 0.86. So that's an example of why it's like this. And you could get the exact value if you calculated the Bellman equation, the full Bellman equation that we have now. The only problem is that there'd be some recursion, because you would need to know the value for this, and then you would need to know the value for this. It's quite complex, and that's why we're not doing the calculations manually here. That's why the AI can do them as it's going through all of this. It's like nothing too complex for the AI to calculate these things. So that's our value here, but now let's take a look at a different one. So here it used to be 0.9, just because of the discounting factor, remember, from here to here. Again, now from here, we can't just jump from here to here, simply because even if we go like this, we might end up back here, right? There's 20% chance that we'll still stay in the square because we'll hit a wall. And again, and so on. So the value of being here is 0.71. Again, the discounting factor, this might look odd to you that this is, even with the discounting factor, this is too high. Maybe the discounting factor in this example is not 0.9, maybe it's 0.99 or something like that. So don't worry about that. Just kind of like focus on that the values have indeed changed, that the values are now less, mostly because it's not 100% probability to get to the state that you want to get. And what you will find an interesting one is here, that here it used to be 0.9 and it actually has dropped very much. It's dropped substantially. Why is that? Well, because if you go from here up, which is our intention, there's a 10% chance of hitting the wall, but there's a 10% chance of actually ending up in the fire pit and losing -1 to reward. And basically that means for the agent, that's end of the game. And so this is a very bad state to be in. So all of a sudden, remember, we had 0.9 here, 0.9. So they were equivalent. It doesn't matter you here or here. They're pretty much equal in terms of value of being in each of these states. But now all of a sudden, bam, this state is like nearly twice as good as this one, simply just because here, if you go straight to, you go right where you want to go, the consequences of the randomness occurring is you just stay here. Here, one of the consequences, the 10% chance, is you end up in the pit. So as you can see, this is no longer such a good state anymore, simply because of something, that fluctuation that could happen. As you can see, this one is also very bad because it's as bad as this one in terms of, there's only a 10% chance of ending up in the pit and 10% chance of ending up in the wall. But at the same time, there's the discounting factor. So first of all, the discounting factor, and also after this one, you'd have to go here. And even if you hypothetically went here, you could end up in the pit again. So that chance would also be taken into account, because remember, this value is derived from this value and this value is derived from this value, right? And therefore it's smaller. But in reality, actually, that what I said there was wrong. This value is not derived from this value. So if you just have a look now, you will notice that this value, V over here, is actually greater than this one. You will notice that for the agent, it's better to go around this way than this way. And it makes sense, right? Because this way, it doesn't lose. There's no chance of getting in the pit. Yes, it's a bit longer, and therefore the discounting factor has a bigger effect. But at the same time, simply because there's a chance of getting in the pit here, if it goes straight, there's a chance of it jumping in the pit. So it'd rather take its time, and it'll just like go around, because that way there's a much lesser chance of it getting a pit. There still is. So if from here it goes there, if from here it goes there, it could potentially get into the pit, because it could end up there and then it could end up in the pit. But nevertheless, it's a lesser chance, so it would just go around like that. So very interesting to see how the route changed. Remember, previously from here you would go like that, from here you'd go like that, and from here you'd go like that. And now all of a sudden you can see it's changed. So let's draw the arrows and see what it looks like now. And oh, voila, you see even a more random thing, right? So yes, this is true, but look at what happened here. Look at this one, and look at this one. Were you expecting that? That's something definitely, like when I saw this for the first time, I was very impressed. I was not surprised. I was surprised, and I was not expecting this at all. And this is an example of, when AI can outsmart a human. It's like something you can't even predict, but the AI, through reinforcement learning, remember that example of the dogs that can actually sometimes walk better than normal real life dogs, or pre-programmed robot dogs, or can play soccer, simply because they come up with these ideas that even we can't see. And so that's a great example, right? So you probably weren't expecting that as well, that the agent, instead of going up, it's like, why would if I go up, then there's a 10% chance I'll jump into the pit. But what does it achieve by going into the wall? Well, 80% of the time it'll bump back and stay in this state, but 10% of the time it'll go here, and 10% of the time it'll go here. So all of a sudden you can see that now it's actually, in this new approach of jumping into the wall, there is a 0% chance it will go into the fire pit from this spot. So, and it's like, it really doesn't want to go into the fire pit, so it rather bounce into the wall a couple of times, and then it will go either right or left at some point, because that randomness is going to happen. And so it learned that through experimentation. It learned that, okay, when I go forward, the results are not as good as when I go to the wall. And if you think about it, it's like this robot. If you think about it, like there's a fire pit, this square is like a very tiny ledge, and then this is like a mountain, like a cliff, and this robot is just hugging the cliff and just like trying to waiting until it like pushes it right or left. because, well, as a human, you'd probably do the same. You wouldn't be standing facing that way or that way. You'd be hugging the cliff, right, or something like that. And hopefully, you never end up in a situation like that. But like visually, if you think about it, same thing here. And so that's pretty intense, right? So that the AI came up with this idea, and same here, that instead of going left and risking getting a fire pit, I'm just going to try bounce off the wall, like, hug the wall, try to jump into the wall. And at some point, I know that, just there's a probability, there's a 10% chance every time I do that, I'll go here and sometimes it will happen and I'll end up here and I'll be safe. And then I'll just keep going like that. So very, very interesting approach that the AI took here. And as you can see, the routes are like this. So from here, it might go right and then it'll go right to the exit, or here it'll go left like that. And here it will, at some point, it will go left and it'll go like that. Again, this is important to understand. It's not a policy. So even when it jumps from here, it will go here, maybe. And then from here, it might actually, instead of going straight, it might actually go back to the right. And then from here, it might go to the left, it might go to the right. So there's lots of different options for it to go. So it might not follow exactly this arrow, it might go the other way. This is just the desired routes that it's designed for itself, but the way it'll work out could be different. It depends on the real world. So there we go. That's the world of artificial intelligence. That's what a policy versus a plan is. And hopefully you're slowly getting excited by what the AI can do, especially given what we saw over here. These are some very virtuoso type of decisions that the AI is coming up with. And as you can see, when you apply AI, even from this small example, you can see that even when you apply AI in the real world, maybe you'll come up with ideas and decisions that even sometimes humans can't come up with. And that's exactly kind of like what happened in those games where the Google AlphaGo was playing versus Lee Sedol, the champion of Go in Korea, back in the world champion of Go, and they were playing in Korea back in 2016. I think it was March 2016. It came up with some moves that humans had never played in 3,000 years, or humans were not used to playing. And this is exactly an example of that. So once again, hope you're getting excited and pumped about this course and about what we're going to create. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, enjoy AI. Hello and welcome back to the course on artificial intelligence. Today we're talking about the living penalty. All right, so here we've got our Bellman equation, and as we've been going through this course, we've been slowly making it more and more complex. So far we've already added these probabilities in here, and also we've added the discounting factor. Now we're going to look in more detail at this side of the equation where we have the reward. Now remember, previously, when we talked about how reinforcement learning works, we said we have an agent and it performs actions in the environment, and in exchange, or as a result of that, it gets a new state in which it's now in and a reward for that action. Well, so far in our example, we've only been getting rewards at the very end, either if we get to the finish line, or if the agent ends up in the fire pit, he gets a +1 or a -1 reward. But that is a very simplistic approach to reinforcement learning, and in more realistic scenarios, you will likely have rewards throughout the journey, not just at the very end. You might have rewards throughout the journey. For instance, if it's an AI playing a game, and if, for example, it's like shooting somebody in Doom, it might get points for killing that enemy. Or it might be in a different other game, if it overtakes another car or something like that, just because of the rules of the game, not because of its way of analyzing the game, but actually the game is structured in a way that it's reinforcing, it's giving points for doing certain actions even before the game is over. So scenarios like that are very common, not just in games and also in real life. And that's why we're going to introduce something similar into our example, a simplified version of that, but nevertheless a reward that is continuously given to the agent throughout the game, not just at the end. And the way we're going to do it is by looking at the other tiles. So right now we only have reward +1 at the final tile and reward -1 at the other final tile, the fire pit. But now we're going to add rewards in every single tile. We'll add a very small reward. It'll be minus 0.04. And as you can see, it's negative. So every time the agent moves, he'll get a negative reward. And that's why it's called a living penalty, because no matter where he goes, he will always get this negative reward, except for these final tiles, because that's the end of the game. And so here you can see the reward even on this tile is minus 0.04, but that doesn't mean that he starts with that reward. He only gets this reward, and this is important to remember, he only gets this reward when he enters a tile. So whenever he performs an action, he goes here, then he will get this reward minus 0.04. And then if he comes back to this tile, he'll get another minus 0.04 reward. And so the longer he walks around, the more he accumulates this negative reward. And therefore, it is an incentive for him to finish the game earlier, as quickly as possible. And so now let's have a look at how our policy, or how the agent's policy, is going to change depending on what value we set for this reward. So here are 4 environments, and in each one we're going to explore a different reward. Now we're not going to do the calculations, we're just going to project the results, and you will see that intuitively they make total sense. So here we've got a reward for any step, or for getting into any state, is equal to 0, just as what we've seen before. Here the reward is going to be minus 0.04, what we just introduced now. Here the reward will be minus 0.5, or the living penalty will be minus 0.5, so much higher, you can see, than here, more than 10 times greater. And here the living penalty will be minus 2, so even more than the reward you get for jumping, or even less than the reward that you or the agent gets for ending up in the fire pit. So let's have a look at how the actions, or the optimal policy for passing this environment will change depending on this reward. So this is our original policy. And as you can remember, we had these 2 very interesting and even a little bit weird decisions by the agent, but which totally makes sense if he can live for as long as he likes, if he can just travel around for as long as he wants without being penalized for staying alive very long. Why not? Why wouldn't he just go into the corner here, into the wall, and just keep doing that until it so happens that he goes this way, and then he will walk around. And same thing here. It's much safer for him to jump into the wall, hoping that one of these will come up eventually, and then he'll go to the finish line anyway. Because by choosing these 2 actions, he doesn't risk getting into the fire pit. Now let's see what happens if we add a reward, a negative reward for just being alive, for making a step, for making a move. So here you can see that instantly these 2 changed. Now the agent doesn't want to jump into the wall. He is more likely to risk getting to the fire pit, having a 10% chance of jumping in here, but he will go forward. Because every time he jumps into the wall here, if he was going to be doing it here as well, every time he jumps into a wall, he performs an action, he ends up in this state with an 80% chance, and that means with an 80% chance he will get a minus 0.04 reward, meaning that a lot of the time he's going to be getting this, accumulating this negative reward. Same thing here. If he jumps into the wall, waiting for that moment when he will actually be randomly moved to the right, if he keeps doing that, he will accumulate this negative reward, and that the result of that, if you perform the calculations, you'll see that the result of that, the expected value of that approach, jumping to the wall, is worse than taking the risk of going forward and actually ending up in the fire pit. So he changes his decisions in these 2 blocks to instead move forward, and here move to the left, even though there's a risk of jumping in the fire pit, simply because now the longer he's alive, the longer he will accumulate this living penalty. In the next environment, now we're increasing the living penalty to even a greater number, minus 0.5, and let's see what changes here. So now you can see that compared to this environment, the only thing that changed here is that this arrow is pointing to the right. And what that means is that now it's no longer a good option for the agent. Oh, actually also this arrow was pointing to the left, and now it's pointing to the upwards. So now it's no longer a good idea for the agent to go around from here, go around all the way, because if he goes around all the way, yes, he's safer. There's no chance of getting into the fire pit. But at the same time, or there's a less chance of getting to the fire pit, but at the same time, he will accumulate quite a substantial negative reward as he walks around. So the path is too long. So that forces him, even whether he's here or here, to take the shorter route to get here, even though he has a much higher risk of getting into the fire pit, because as soon as he ends up in the square, there's a 10% chance of getting into the fire pit. According to his calculations, it's just the expected value of this approach is better than the expected value of going around, simply because we've increased this living penalty. And finally, we're getting to the example with the living penalty of minus 2.0. So here, I will encourage you to pause the video now that you've seen how the policy has changed as we increase the living penalty. I encourage you to pause the video and to think for yourself, what will happen in this scenario? What do you think the optimal policy will be, given that the living penalty is so high? So I'll let you pause the video if you'd like to. And now I'm going to jump into showing you the solution. So in this case, if you increase the penalty to minus 2.0, it's so high. Remember that the penalty here is only minus 1.0. It's so high that the agent just wants to get out of the game in any way possible. Even if it's just by jumping into the fire pit, he will do it. He will be like, every time I make a step, every time I end up in a new state, or every time I make an action, I end up getting a minus 2 reward. So what's the point of trying to get to the finish line if from here it'll take me 2 extra steps? I'm just going to go here and then straight into the fire pit, because that way my reward is going to be less. The negative reward is not going to be as bad as in the case of just making additional steps. So you can see that adding this living reward, and depending on the value of the living reward that we're adding, the results are going to be different, and the agent is going to select different policies. And that's basically how the reward value is incorporated by the Bellman equation, even when it's not just at the finish line or at the end of the game, but even throughout the game. And once again, it doesn't have to be on every single in every single state. Depending on the environment itself, it might be given to the agent at certain specific states, not at every state. But in our simplistic example, we're just using rewards at every given state to illustrate this concept. So I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial. And as you can see, we've already made our Bellman equation quite sophisticated, and now it can be applied to many different scenarios. And I can't wait to see you in the next tutorial. And until then, enjoy AI. Hello and welcome back to the course on artificial intelligence. Today we are finally talking about Q-learning. All right, so we've already got this equation, the Bellman equation, which we've added lots of components to. We've got the reward here, which can be not just at the very end, but it can be at any given step. We've got the discount factor. We've got the probability, because now we're looking at Markov decision processes, and here we've got the probability of ending up in different states regardless of what action we take, or actually given the action we take, there can be multiple states that we can end up in, and then we've got the value of the next state. So you can see it's kind of like a recursive function and so on. But you probably still have one question. The question is, where in all of this is the letter Q? Why is it all called Q learning? So where's the Q? And that's the question that we're going to be answering today. So far, we've been dealing with values, the value of being in a certain state. And now we're going to look at how Q fits into all of that as well. So here we've got two examples. On the left is what we've been doing so far. Our agent has been analyzing, okay, I'm over here. This is a Markov decision process, so it doesn't matter how I got here. The rest of the environment doesn't care of the steps that it took me to get here. From now on, I have to make the optimal decision where to go, here, here, or here, based on the current state and all the future states that come from here, but not from the past. And so he can see that there's three options. There's state 1, state 2, state 3. And based on his experience, he has calculated the values in these states. And now he's going to, using the Bellman equation, so even that though this is a stochastic process, so he knows that he'll go here, but there's a chance that he'll go left or right, and so on. So based on these values, he's going to make a decision. That's what we've been doing so far, and that is totally the legitimate approach here. But now we're going to modify it a little bit. We're going to take the same exact concept, same exact problem, but here, instead of looking at the values of each state that he can end up in, we're going to look at the values or the value of each action. So we're not going to use the letter V anymore because V is for the value of the state. We're going to use Q. And you might have a question, why the letter Q? Well, Q, some people speculate that Q, well, I read this, I think, on Quora. Somebody mentioned that Q is because of quality. But at the same time, I couldn't find any other references to that. So it might not be because of that. It might be just because that's the letter that was used at the time. And now it became super popular because it's all called Q learning because of that. So no exact reason why it's called Q, but nevertheless, at least it helps us distinguish between V and Q. So Q here represents, rather than the value of the state, it represents, let's go with quality. It represents the quality of the action. It represents, okay, so I've got 4 actions. What are the different qualities of these actions? What is the, or the value of the action or the quality of the action? Which action is more lucrative? So I need a metric telling me, all right, how do I quantify this action? And then I can compare them. And that is exactly what Q is. And so here he's got 4 possible actions. As always, go up, right, left, or down. And based on the action, there's going to be a formula which tells us the quantifiable value of that action, which we're calling the Q value of that action. So let's have a look at how we're going to derive this formula for Q. How does it actually relate to V? Because as you can imagine, because actions lead to states, there has to be some sort of link between the two. Right? We've already determined how to calculate this, and we're pretty good at it. We know how to use the Bellman equation in very different environments with lots of different complications. Well, let's leverage that knowledge to understand how we can now calculate Q in order to make the same predictions. Because as you can imagine, the environment doesn't change depending on what approach we use. The environment is going to be the same regardless. So therefore, this approach and this approach should always give the same result. And therefore, that's another reason why these two should be linked. So let's have a look. So here's our V approach, where we're just going to look at the value of any given state, this state, any other state. And here we're just using the letter S here because that's the current state. And so therefore, the terminology will be the same in both equations. And here we're using QSA. Q is of the state S and the action A, because action is up, but in which state did we perform that action? We performed that action in state S. Okay, so now we're going to write out the Bellman equation for the first approach. As you can see here, we've got V of S, so the value of any given state S is the maximum of the reward that you get. So maximum based on the actions, so you have 3, in this case you actually have 4 actions. So maximum out of all the possible actions, and then of this part, which we've already discussed many times. So this is our reward that we get from performing that action in that state, plus a discounted factor multiplied by the expected value of the new state that we're going to be in. An expected value because it is a stochastic process. We don't know exactly for sure that we're going to end up over here. We might end up on the left or the right with a certain probability. That's why these probabilities are in here. All right, so that's our value. And now let's look at Q. So Q is going to be defined. We're going to use this to define Q. So let's say the agent from this location, from this state, performed the action up. What is the Q value going to be equal to? Well, first of all, let's see what he'll get in return. For performing this action up, first thing that you'll get is a reward, right? That's no doubt about it. There's going to be some sort of reward. It might be 0, but we know that the way this reinforcement learning process works is that sometimes for performing certain actions from a given state, there's a reward. So we're going to add that in here. And then we're going to add, what are we going to add? Well, let's think about it. What is the next thing that happens after he's gotten the reward? Well, the next thing that happens is that now the agent is in a certain state. He could end up here with a 80% probability or some probability, but actually he could end up here or here. But wherever he ends up, now we already have a quantified metric for that state he's in, and that is actually the V value of that state. But because he can end up in many different states, in 3 of the possible different states, we have to look at the expected value of the state that he'll be in. And so we're going to add that in. We're going to add, of course, the discounted factor as we previously had, because that is somewhere in the future. And then we're going to add the sum of across all possible states that he could end up in by taking this action times the probability. So what we're saying here is that, okay, so by performing an action, you're going to get a reward plus, which is a quantified metric, plus you end up in a state. We don't know which one. It could be here, it could be here, it could be here. But here is the expected value of the state that you're going to end up in. And now we're going to multiply it by discounting factor because that is one move away. So that is our Q value for performing this action. And what you will notice here right away is that the Q value is actually exactly identical to what's inside these brackets over here. And why is that? Well, if you think about it, here we're taking the maximum of the result we will get, the maximum across all possible actions. So we've got 4 actions, and we're taking the maximum across all possible actions of the result that we'll get by taking each of those actions. And in Q, we're defining, interesting, what will we get by taking a certain action? So if you think about it, it makes sense that the value of a state, so for instance, this state, is the maximum of all of the possible Q values, right? So here in this state, by being in the state, the agent has 1 Q value, 2 Q value, 3 Q value, 4 Q values. So he has 4 possible Q values. Well, the value of this state, it makes sense that the value of the state is the maximum of all of those 4 Q values. And that is exactly what we can see here. That's a good confirmation of this new formula that we derived. If that wasn't the case, if that didn't match up, then we would have questions. We'd be like, so why doesn't it match? Why doesn't it match up if Q value is a quantified metric of performing an action, and V depends on is the maximum of the possible results of the 4 actions that he can perform. Hopefully that makes sense, and that confirms the formula that we've just derived. And now we're going to make it even more interesting. We're going to get rid of the V entirely, because you can see here you got V is a recursive function of V. So, and then we got V, and then V, and then V, and then V, and so on. So you can express this V through all of the following V's, the most optimal V's that will come up. Here, we're expressing Q as a recursive function of V, or as a function of the next V. And then we would have to plug in this V, and then we'd get back to the V. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this V, and we're going to replace it with Q, right? So let's have a look at that. We're going to take this V of the next state, and we're going to plug this into that formula over here. And as you can see now, so this part doesn't change, this probability doesn't change. But as we just discussed, V of S is the maximum by all actions of Q of S and A, right, over here. So that's what we're going to replace in here. So we're going to say a maximum of course, it's the new action, the action that we're going to take, because here we've got V of S prime. So here now we've got the maximum across all A primes, so the actions that we're going to take from this state, or from whichever other state we end up in. But the action that we're going to take from there, and a maximum across all those, and the maximum is of all of the Q values that are available to us in that new state, S prime, comma A prime, and that's the action. So there's going to be another 4 Q values there. So now, as you can see, let's go through that again. So as from what we derived, as from what we discussed, just through logic and intuition, so that we can see that V and S are actually, V of S and Q of S and A are linked. V of S is the maximum across all actions of Q of S and A. You can see it right here. So this part is identical to this part. And then we're going to leverage that, and we're going to replace this bit with V at S from here, but not this exact formula. We're going to take this internal part, and we're going to replace it with Q of an S and A. So we're going to plug that in here, and this part is going to be Q of S prime A prime. So maximum of Q by across all A primes of Q S prime A prime. And now we have our formula. So now we have a recursive formula for the Q value. So now the agent can think, what's the value of this action? What's the quality of this action? What's the Q value of this action? Well, it depends on the reward I get in the immediate step after that. Plus, it depends on the discounted factor times the maximum of all the possible Q actions in that state, but I don't know if I'm going to get there. So I need to also look at that state. And that's why we have this expected value over here. So we have this sum, probability times the maximum, and that's our expected value. So very similar formula as you can see, but this time we're expressing things through the Q values. And that's why this whole algorithm is called Q learning, because this is what is looked at. This is what the agents actually use. They don't look at the states, they look at their possible actions, and then based on the actions, on the Q values of the actions, they will decide which action to take. So they'll just look at the maximum Q value in this given state. It has 4 actions. What is the best action to take? So it can compare, instead of comparing the different states it can end up in, it's going to compare the possible actions that it currently has. Then by finding the optimal one, it's going to take that action, and then it's going to repeat that process, and so on. So now you can see how all of this comes together, how the reward, the discounting factor, the stochastic Markov decision processes, and the V values and the Q values all come together in order to give us this one super powerful Bellman equation for Q values, which we can now apply and let our agents learn how to beat the environment. And so that is a intuitive explanation of what's going on. I know we went through the formulas, but it is necessary because this is like our formula that we've been going through this whole chapter. And I think it's a good transition from V to Q, and it illustrates how they're linked between each other. And if you'd like to get a bit more of a rigorous approach, mathematical approach, and like you see the mathematics behind it and learn a bit more about Q values and how they work, then we've got some additional reading for you. This paper is called Markov Decision Processes, Concepts and Algorithms by Martin van Otterlo, 2009. So you've got the link here as always. And here you can read in a bit more detail to understand all the nitty-gritty behind Q values and so on. And now that we've discussed all of these things relating to the Bellman equation, now we are ready to look at something more complex, such as this paper, in order, if we want to get some additional information on this, in order to kind of get a deeper understanding. But even if you don't read through this paper already, you should have a good working knowledge of what Q learning is all about and how agents come up with the actions that they need to take in a certain environment. So I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, enjoy AI. Hello and welcome back to the course on artificial intelligence. Today we're talking about the temporal difference. Now, it's a very important tutorial because temporal difference is the heart and soul of the Q learning algorithm. This is actually how everything we've learned so far comes together into play inside Q learning. So let's have a look. Remember the time when we talked about deterministic versus non-deterministic search? And remember how we said in this case, it's when the agent wants to go up, he definitely goes up. And when in this case he wants to go up, there's a 10% chance he'll go left, 10% chance he'll go right, and an 80% chance he'll go right, go straight up. Well, these numbers are, of course, arbitrary and can be different. And this whole concept is could be different in different problems. So it doesn't have to concern which way he's moving, just that there's some randomness, something that's out of the control of the agent happening inside this environment. And what effect that had is, as you remember, was that in the deterministic example, it was very easy to calculate the V values. Well, not necessarily always very easy, but in our case, we could just simply calculate them by using the Bellman equation, and we had the exact values. And then, as you remember, I very carefully mentioned that these values for the non-deterministic search example are off the top of my head. They're not calculated. At that time I said we're just not going to calculate them because it's very complex, but the computer could do it. And we just went along with these values that are just values that I made up, but they did get the job done. They helped us understand the concepts. Well, now we're going to return to that a little bit and understand what exactly is going on here? Why is it so much harder to calculate these values in the non-deterministic example? Or generally speaking, in these problems, in these environments and the agent going through them, why can it be so hard to calculate these values? Well, when you think about it, because when the agent moves, for instance, from here to the right, he doesn't necessarily always move that way. Sometimes there's a chance that he'll go when instead of going straight. So let's call these northeast, southwest. So instead of going west, the agent might sometimes go south. And for instance, from here, instead of going north, he might sometimes go east. So here, instead of going east, he might sometimes go south. And here, instead of going north, he might sometimes go east or west. And here, instead of going north, he might sometimes go east or west, and so on. And therefore, in order to calculate this value, you would need to know what this value is. But the interesting thing is that in order to calculate this value, you need to know what this value is. So there's a lot of recursion happening here, and therefore you cannot just define what these values are. And on top of that, this recursion is not deterministic. It is sometimes it happens this way, sometimes instead of going up, he'll go right, sometimes instead of going up, he'll go left, sometimes instead of when he wants to go up, he will go up. So it is subject to chance. And so maybe many times the agent will go through this path and he'll go up, and he'll think that from here he always kind of goes up, and so the value of the state will be good, and then all of a sudden he'll drop into the pit and this value will go down. And so therefore you can see how there is some stochasticity or randomness to this whole calculation of these values, because they're all interlinked, plus on top you've got that randomness that's inherent in the environment because there's a Markov decision process. So that's where all of this comes together, and that's where we're going to introduce the concept of the temporal difference, which will allow the agent to calculate these values. And here we were dealing with V values, and since then we've already moved on to Q values, so that's what we're going to be working with. We're going to be looking at Q values. So as you recall, this is our Bellman equation for Q values. So a Q value, or the value of performing a certain action A in state S, is equal to the reward that you get after performing that action, so immediately after performing that action, plus you get the maximum, you get the gamma of the sum of all the possible, so you kind of get the expected value of the state that you will end up in. So as you recall, that was our formula for the Bellman equation. And now, just for simplicity's sake, we're going to rewrite it in the old-fashioned way, in the way that we used to talk about the Bellman equation before we knew about the stochasticity. So, as you remember, this was our Bellman equation in the sense of a deterministic search example, because here you don't have that expected value, you don't have the sum across all probabilities, you just have that as if it's determined where you're going to end up, what state you're going to end up, and then you're taking the max in that one state. And the reason we're rewriting it is simply, the only reason is because it is just easier to write it, and it'll be easier to us to follow along with the formula. So we're going to just remember that we replaced this part with this part, and also you'll find this notation in a lot of literature, so it'll be easier for you to follow along with other sources if you're studying those. But do remember that, in fact, what we mean is this probabilistic approach here instead of this notation. It's just easier for us to operate this and understand what's going on, and just kind of like look at the equations so that they're not too cluttered. But once again, just remember that, in fact, what we mean is this probabilistic approach over here. And so we're actually nearly done, so let's have a look at what's going on. So here is our blank state of the maze. We don't have any Q values. Let's see, or we may, but let's just keep it blank for now. Let's just look at one of the states, so at one of the cells, this one specifically. And here we have, for instance, for the action of going up, we have a Q value that we've calculated. So it's not that we don't have any Q values yet. We do, but we're just not illustrating anything. We're just keeping it blank for simplicity's sake. But we have the agent has been walking around for some time, and let's say hypothetically somehow he's calculated this Q value of going up or north from this state, from this specific cell, and the value is Q, S, and A. And so now what we have, so he is currently where this blue arrow is pointing. The agent is sitting in this cell. And now he needs to make a choice. Where is he going to go? And he knows the value of the action going north, and that is QSNA. And here I'm saying before. And the reason for that is because that is before he takes action. He hasn't taken the action yet, so he's still in the cell. And before he's taken the action, the value here is Q and SNA. And now he actually takes the action. So let's say he decides this is the best one, he takes the action, and he moves up to this cell. Well, now what happens is, now comes after. So after he's taken action, we can measure what is this value. Let's just calculate this value. The value of the reward for taking that action plus gamma times the maximum of this new state that he's just gotten into, S prime. And so the maximum across all possible actions in S prime. And so what we have here is the value before of that action, and then we've calculated this metric afterwards. But as you can recall from the previous formula, so if we go back very quickly, from the previous formula, what we just calculated is indeed the value. That is how Q of SNA is calculated. So this right part, we've just calculated it separately, but after we've taken the action. So as once again, before we knew a Q of an SNA value, something that we've calculated through our iterations previously. So a value that's stored in our memory, so just like a number that we know. And now after the actions being performed, we know what reward he actually got, what reward the agent actually got, and we can calculate this new value. So in essence, we're kind of recalculating this value, but now with new information. The new information is the reward that we got. And plus what state we ended up in and what the maximum across that state, for what this new value is for that specific state that we're looking at. So what the value of that being in that state is. So basically the Q of an SNA, but given new information. And now the temporal difference is defined as TD of A and S of these two, of the difference between these two. So here, the first element is your after value. So the kind of like Q of SNA, but calculated afterwards. And the previous Q of an SNA, which you had stored in your memory. And so the question is, are they different? So ideally, they should be the same. Ideally, this should be the same as this, simply because this is the formula for calculating this. But the thing is that this is not something we calculate. This is something that we have from empirical evidence, something that we have from just going through the maze many times and calculating. So this is something we've come up with so far. It's not related to the current iteration. It's something that we came up with previously, not a long time ago, but in one of our previous iterations going through the maze. Whereas this is something we've calculated just now. And there's no guarantee that they're going to be the same. Because of the randomness that exists in the maze. Because this could have been calculated and some certain random events were triggered, and this can be calculated, different random events were triggered. And so now let's rewrite that over here. Let's just move it up there. So how do we use this? The question is, okay, so we have this temporal difference. How do we use this? And why is it called a temporal difference? Well, the reason it's called a temporal difference is because you're basically calculating the same thing. You're calculating Q of SNA, so the Q value of that action. You're calculating it here and you're calculating it here. But the difference is time. This is your Q of SNA previously. This is your Q of SNA now, your new Q of SNA. And the question is, has there been a difference? Have there been a shift between them in time? And how can we use this to our advantage if there is indeed has been a shift in time? Well, one thing we could do is we could say, okay, well, our Q of SNA this new value doesn't equal the old, so we're going to get rid of the old. We'll forget about the old, and we'll just use this as our new value. But that would not be smart. And the reason for that is that in our environment, random events can sometimes happen. And what if our old QS of SNA was something that, consistently happens like 80% of the time, and then was represented by what happens 80% of the time, and then this new one just what happened due to randomness. In that case, we're going to throw away the one that is responsible for the bulk of the situation, and we're going to replace it with something that happens only 10 or 20% of the time. that wouldn't be the best approach to go. And that's exactly why we don't want to completely change our Q values. We want to change them step by step, a little bit by little bit. And that's why we're going to use this temporal difference in a specific way. So we're going to say, here's a formula. We're going to take our Q of S and A, and we're going to update it in such a way. We're going to take the old value of Q, S, and A, and we are going to add alpha times the temporal difference. So alpha is going to be our learning rate. That's a new parameter that we're introducing. That's how quickly is the algorithm learning. So basically, we're taking this difference, and whatever it is, we're adding it on to our previous Q of S and A. Now, this formula probably doesn't make any sense, or like just by looking, it doesn't make any sense because you've got Q of S and A here and Q of S and A here. It's the same thing, so it probably should negate each other. But we're going to rewrite this in a bit of a different way. So I'm just going to show you again. So I'm just adding time to these formulas. So here is Qt minus 1, the previous. Here's Qt minus 1, the previous. Here's Qt, the new. There should be a circle here, a red circle here as well, but never mind. And here we've got alpha temporal difference, the current temporal difference. So you can see what we're doing. We're saying, okay, let's take our current Q is going to be equal to our previous Q plus whatever temporal difference we found times alpha. This formula over here is the heart and soul of the Q-learning algorithm. This is how the Q values are updated. And it's good that we've already learned what Q values are, what gamma is, what R is, and what all of this stuff is. And now all we need to see is that you have a previous Q value. Yes, that's good. And then what can happen is that when you actually do take the action, when the agent takes action, he'll get a reward and he'll end up in a state. And so based on that, he can calculate, okay, so what should have been the Q value of that move that I made? And now that is this part of the equation. Subtract the old Q value, gets you temporal difference. And now you need to take a alpha times temporal difference. And that's how you're going to adjust your Q value. That's what you're going to adjust your Q value by. And now just to finish off, this is kind of like, this is sufficient to understand what's going on. But just to clarify things even more, or perhaps maybe confuse things even more, what we're going to do is we're going to take this temporal difference, or this temporal difference over here, and we're going to plug it into this formula. So we're going to take all of this part and plug it into this formula and end up with a huge equation. So here we go. There's our equation. So this is the full equation with the temporal difference written out completely. And the reason I wrote this out is, well, first of all, you'll probably find this in other literature if you study it. And the second thing is that it makes some things a bit more complex. Yes, the formula is longer, but also makes some things a bit clearer. So for instance, you can see here the role alpha plays. You can see it better because look at this. Here you've got Qt minus 1, and here you got Qt minus 1 with a negative sign. So if you plug in alpha equals to 1, if you put a 1 in here, then this will negate with this. So they'll destroy each other. And all you'll have left is this part. And what that means is exactly that situation where we said, all right, so we've got a new value, which it should have been. Let's update our Q value with the new value and forget about whatever we had previously. And as we discussed, that's not the best approach because there are random events here and we want to update things step by step. And on the other hand, if you set alpha equal to 0, what happens then is that you completely forget about this whole part and your Qt, the new one or the current one, is going to be always equal to the previous one. So you're not going to be learning anything. And that means whatever is happening in the maze doesn't matter because you've decided on your Qt value a long time ago and you're just going to keep it. And so that's why alpha shouldn't be 0 or shouldn't be 1. It should be somewhere in between, and it's going to allow you to learn slowly, step by step. It's going to allow you to, the agent, as it goes through the maze, is going to get this temporal difference, and slowly and surely this value is going to get updated and updated and updated. And what will happen eventually is that at some point, hopefully, the algorithm will converge. And what that means is that this temporal difference will start becoming closer and closer to 0, and eventually will be just, well, very close to 0, or even 0, 0, 0, 0. And what that means is that every single time your new Qt value or your new calculated value what it should have been. So not this one, but what it hypothetically should have been after you take the step will be just equal to your previous QT value. And then it's 0. And that means when your temporal difference is 0, it means your algorithm has converged, and it's not really necessary to continue updating what's going on. It's not necessary to continue updating your Q values. The caveat here is that the only time, probably one of the only times when you would still want to continue performing this whole, updating of your Q values, if the environment is constantly changing. If not just, it's not that it just has some random stochastic events in it, but the environment itself is modifying, is morphing, is changing with time. So you continuously need to learn, because it's not possible for you to learn everything and come up with the optimal policy, because the optimal policy is also changing with the environment all the time. In that case, you will need to continue calculating temporal difference and calculating the Q values. But other than that, that's kind of like an extra complication. Other than that, this is how Q values are updated. So this is the main formula of the Q learning algorithm. And this is kind of like the expanded version of that. And now it should all come together and make sense why we have the Bellman equation, and not only what it represents, the Q values, but also how the agent goes about updating its Q values and finding exactly what is going on in that environment so it can come up with the optimal policy. So I know this is quite a lot to take in, but hopefully you enjoyed today's tutorial, and hopefully you were able to take away the underlying concepts and intuition behind Q values, and what the whole notion of temporal difference is, and why it's important, why it helps us slowly train our agents and get them to understand their environments that they're operating in. And if you'd like to learn a bit more about temporal differences, then a very popular paper is Learning to Predict by the Methods of Temporal Differences by Richard Sutton of 1988. We've already had a reference by Richard Sutton as well, but this is another one, and actually he has a book. So if you get into his writing style and his style of communication, then check out his book as well. It's kind of like a more expanded version of all of these things. I haven't read the book, but that's what I'm imagining. At the same time, this is the link to the paper, and you can learn a bit more about, or probably a lot more about, temporal differences there. And I hope you enjoyed today's tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, enjoy AI.